The future is an exciting place. It's also a place of great uncertainty and certainly of accelerated change, of accelerating speeds and accelerating cycles. So in today's Humble Pie, we are going to feature a conversation that took place as part of the Humble Mind learning group that I host every week, a particular group called Exponential Thinking. And I was very fortunate to have a conversation with a strategic futurist and a futures practitioner called Jon Cherry, as well as being joined by international speaker John Wiley, who was able to really jump into quite an amazing, wide-ranging, very explorative and great conversation that I've listened back to many times now, just around where things are going, the future shock, the technological changes that are coming, and also just exploring different ways of thinking, different ways of looking at the exponential future that's in front of us, and finding a different way in while remaining open-minded and open-hearted at the same time. That's to come right now on The Humble Pie. Welcome back to The Humble Pie. Very glad to have you with me. Thank you so much. Like I said, today's conversation was recorded a couple days ago from Humble Mind, from the Humble Mind learning group that I host with like-minded individuals every week. And the theme of this learning group is exponential thinking. And so one of the first sessions, we've had Jon Cherry come in and talk to the group. So this is the conversation that I thought was just so fantastic to share and to make sure a wider audience gets part of it, gets part of the conversation. So without further ado, here's the conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Okay, so for context, Jonathan Cherry, you're a futurist, a researcher, a strategist, a master marketer, a strategic facilitator. You've worked with names like British American Tobacco, Dimension Data, Unilever, Woolworths, to name a few, including the institution we were just talking about, Stellenbosch University. And the reason why I wanted you and your perspective on this is that you've got a very unique take on, how brands and businesses in particular are continuing to sort of make an impact on customers and audiences around the world, especially now in this sort of exponential time where the faster we go, the closer the future looms, the crazier and sort of more uncertain things become. And so I wanted to kind of just kick off and first get your thoughts on the fact that, the world is going nuts. According to you, what is going on? What's got your attention?
In the 1970s, someone by the name of Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Future Shock. And the thesis of the book was that this, in the same way that when you travel to a different country, you potentially can experience culture shock. The culture is so different from what you're used to that in many ways you feel disorientated in that new culture. And what he said in that book is that in the future, people will experience something similar, but it will be what he termed future shock, as in the rate of change that is happening in the world is happening so quickly, or the perception is that it's changing so quickly, that we will be in a state of shock, suffer from mental illness, depression, anxiety. Our ability to cope with that reality will be severely challenged. So in many ways, what we are experiencing now is not necessarily anything new. It was kind of forecast by this person in the 1970s. Now, understandably, what he was looking at was that he was looking at technological change and how that technological change would really start to affect culture. And in many ways, what he was suggesting is that when everyone has access to knowledge and tools to communicate in real time, what ends up happening is a kind of fragmentation of society and fragmentation of culture. So my feeling is that on a deeper level, if you're looking at what's happening within people and within societies and culture, it's just that we are now so disorientated with the news that's coming, at us. And it's news which is not necessarily unbiased news. There are all sorts of reasons as to why people share news and what kind of news and for what purpose. And I think in many ways, we're just feeling completely overwhelmed with the perceived change which is all around us. And that is a real danger, because my interest, as you said, Alex, is very much in the future. And the future is really the only place where you have agency. It's the only place where you have any kind of control. It's the only place where you can personally or as an organization affect change. And as the saying goes, futures can be created, futures can be designed, and futures can be made. But in many ways, because of the way that we're feeling in this present moment, a lot of our futures have been hijacked by other people. So they have been hijacked by, for argument's sake, people in Silicon Valley who have a specific agenda to sell a certain kind of technology. So they want you to feel that the future cannot exist without that technology as part of it. Now, that's not to say that that's incorrect. It could well be the case. But I think what's happening is that we are handing over our agency for the future to others. And in the futures world, you call that a used future. It's not a future which you yourself have and you've designed it for your own purposes and what you want. It's something which is handed over to you. And there's some very interesting case studies where in Asia, a lot of the cities were designed and built to be replicas of cities in Europe and North America, which was they borrowed designs which contextually, which were not necessarily appropriate for their region, but they took a used future and they applied it to their own context. And the same problems that beset cities in North America and Europe then obviously were created within their own cultures and their own cities. So that's just a very simple example where the future is where you can create what is best for you. And I think the real danger right now is, as I say, we're kind of blindly just adopting stories and narratives and futures which seem to be the prevailing future, but we kind of get a sense that there are no other options. The future's been determined and we have no control to change that future. And that's why I'm interested in futures, because that's not necessarily the case. But it does take a lot of work to change that. Personal work, organizational work, and research, and and the doing of creating these plans.
Would you say then, it's so interesting what you said. I've got about 5 or 6 other follow-up questions, but I'll probably forget most of them. But I kind of want to go back to what you said about this sort of the perception of change happening. And I suppose that's where your work and I suppose to some degree, when we're talking about agency, that's where everybody's work is. It's to be able to sort of work and manage with that perception of things changing, whether or not they change, or whether or not they change meaningfully, is maybe up for debate, or perhaps that's a completely separate phenomenon. Just like you said earlier, we've been through these sorts of cycles many times, or perhaps it's something that really isn't, it's business as usual in a bigger sense, in a macro sense, but maybe in a micro sense, it's perceived to be major changes where it's all speeding up, it's all kind of going crazy. And to some degree, like you said, we're maybe a little bit powerless over it.
Well, we seem to be powerless to restrict the stimulus which is coming at us. And I think that's where the real powerlessness comes in. And as I say, these, the change is obviously happening all of the time. Change is constant. But in many ways, there are a lot of things that haven't changed. The way that societies work, the way that human beings work, the way we think about things. In many ways, our own brains are ancient. And that's why we're struggling with all of this stimulus, because our brains are just not, evolution hasn't allowed it to be able to process so much bandwidth of information that's coming at us at any one point. So I suppose my feeling is, and this is my own personal experience, is that because we're an always on culture, we have, our phones are basically an intravenous drip of information, which is being fed
Yeah.
to us all of the time. Uh, and that information is in many instances quite shocking in nature. Artificial intelligence arrives, the first thing we do is we go, oh my goodness, my job is probably in jeopardy. When? Is it this week, next week, 100 years? I need to start thinking. I need alternatives. So you then ruminate these things. You get into groups. It's on the radio. It's on TV. We discuss all of these things. And all of a sudden, something which is a technology, which has actually been around for quite some time, all of a sudden becomes a major threat. And experts are telling us that this could be a major threat, and then it becomes a threat. So that threat in our minds all of a sudden becomes real. And the unfortunate thing is that what we believe in comes true. The future that we buy into is the future which we then create. And the real danger is that there's not much variety in the futures that are being sold to us. Most of the futures are dystopian. Most of the futures that are being fed to us are that the world is aging, economic growth has pretty much come to an end.
It's like a giant Black
AI
Mirror
is here to
episode.
take our jobs.
Yeah.
You switch on Netflix or some entertainment and there's Black Mirror, and like you just can't get away from it.
Yeah.
It's a narrative which is pervasive, and I think that that's hugely disempowering. And in many ways, as someone who works in the space, I'm very, very cautious to talk about like trends. You have like these trend hits, and you can tune into millions of websites and watch lots of YouTube videos and sign into podcasts where they talk about the changes that are happening every single day. But in many ways, if you have to focus on those changes, you're going to drive yourself absolutely crazy. And that's just not the way to do it. What you need to do is look at the big patterns of history. What are the major changes and how did they affect civilizations? And I think it's far more useful to look at things like, how did the Industrial Revolution evolve over time? So how did it start? How did it evolve? How did it kind of like give way to the information age and the digital revolution, and try and understand where we're at based on that major pattern of change, which we can track from history. So I just think that at times there is value in understanding how granular trends are evolving, but for the average person, I just think it creates noise and chaos in people's minds, which is disempowering. There are far better ways of thinking about the future.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about trends, because perhaps as access and technological kind of determinism and all that has made everyone who's everyone join the internet, and now a trend which might have been a big concept 20 or 30 years ago, nowadays there's a new trend every day. Right. And so everything is kind of becoming nichified. Look at CNN in the 90s when they covered the Gulf War, the first kind of live war reporting from the front lines, right? Nowadays, when that kind of thing comes on, we switch it off. So the trends as an idea, it's almost as if it's kind of losing its impetus. I'm interested in your kind of futurists toolkit on how you go then. How do you go about in making sense of sort of the future? Is it about understanding the past better? Do you look for different kinds of patterns? How do you look at what's happening?
Yeah, so as you say, I like your use of the word toolkit. I think professional futurists are practitioners. And when you work with a group of people, you facilitate their thinking. So in any situation, what you've really got to understand is what is required from the group of people. And you have to spend quite a lot of time in understanding what they say verbally, because they might say, well, we need a new strategy as to how we must grow this business. We're faced with technological change. We need to adopt technology. We need a strategy as to how we're going to do that. On the surface of it, yes, that might be the case. But what do they actually need? Why are they all of a sudden requiring growth? Do they really need growth, or do they rather need to innovate? Do they need to shift their focus? Do they need Do they need a deeper understanding of potentially where the world is going and how they can fit in different ways? So a large part of the toolkit is first understanding what the job is. And that can take a while. Then what you've got to do is you've got to understand, right, now that you understand that the question is futures related, because it might not be. It might be psychology related, or it might be culture related. But if you've now determined that it's futures related, you now need to frame and you need to scope exactly what it is that you're trying to determine. What are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve here? And once you've got that, you understand that any individual or organization doesn't work in isolation. It works within the context of these great shifts. So,
Right.
In futures work, you think at a minimum of 5 years to 10 years time. So in 5 years and 10 years, there are certain behaviors and actions and trends and innovations and ideas which are emerging now, which have implications for the future. So what you then need to determine is how might these things shift and what are they going to impact? How are they going to interconnect with other parts of society? So if you just take a simple example like artificial intelligence, that's a technology innovation, which immediately now you can see how it's starting to affect culture. So you've got something which is a technology and it's starting to change the way people work. We just listened to Jon tell us about how he's changed the way that he writes scripts. Now that's in a very short space of time. In less than a year, he might have hired somebody to kind of sense check what he was thinking before. But now he's working in a more isolationist kind of way. So if you're working in an isolated environment, what does that then mean for the way that you develop your ideas? Because before you would have developed them within community. And potentially that's why your channel, Alex, is now, offers real value, because we're all working as individuals. Yeah. It's nice to actually then just connect with a community of like-minded people in a forum like this. So you can see now that just in a year, we've mapped out some changes, but of real value would be to say, right, how are those things going to affect countries and continents and businesses in 5 years' time? Now, you can never predict that, but what you can do is say, right, here are some interesting ideas. If we have to take AI and we have to take, the mindset where people are quite protectionist and they're trying to close their borders and they don't want immigrants coming into their countries. You combine those two together and you say, right, give it some time, give it some political upheavals and all that kind of stuff. What might that then mean for how we build economies in 5 years' time? All of a sudden, governments might not be wanting to attract young talent. They're going to be wanting to attract, artificial intelligence solutions which they alone own.
Yeah.
So that's the first step, is that you've got to understand how the conditions might change. Because now if you're thinking, right, how am I going to now work in that, or how's my business going to create products in that new environment, you would look at that one scenario or that one future and you would say, right, should the future play out like this, this is how we would then operate. But yes, there's never just one future. There are multiple futures. So that's why you use something like scenario planning, to understand the various scenarios, and based under those scenarios, what would you then do? And the value of futures thinking is not necessarily in kind of getting a prediction right and then having the right strategy and sort of lining up the dots, if you will. What it is it builds some kind of mental resilience within that organization. So that no matter what actually plays out, mentally you're prepared. So that whole thing that we were talking about, future shock, you can really train yourself and upskill yourself to be far more in control of your future. As you said, the future is uncertain, but that doesn't mean to say that the future should then control you. So if you are very good at futures thinking, if you are adept at this kind of work, if you have a futurist on board, if you're doing these kind of exercises all the time, you're just going to have a lot more confidence to then innovate and work within whatever context is presented to you.
I love this concept of, okay, so sort of in the toolkit is, a great deal of imagination, a good understanding of history and of cycles, but it seems also the ability to, like you said, not just predict or to sort of think about what changes might be coming, but also to be very observant of the reactions that people have to these changes, right? As they kind of like, oh, okay, this is a new force in my life right now in the way that I'm dealing with my business or whatever it might be. Now I'm going to have to innovate or create something or completely change or reimagine something. So it's almost as if there's this kind of probabilistic thinking, which I think is an insanely invaluable human kind of skill. You know, there's something very human about it, but there's something I think very valuable about that. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of probabilistic sort of thinking and or scenario planning, as you said, and how that works, or how somebody could go about that with, you know, especially if they don't, you know, have a university degree or need to be a professor?
Right. So if you look at this category, which let's just call it futures research or futures thinking. So it's studying and trying to understand how the future might be. You know, what agency do we have in the future? If you look at this as a discipline, in many ways you can see that there are two distinct strands. The one strand is very much an empirical scientific strand that emanated out of North America. So after World War II, during the Cold War, they needed strategies in order to understand how a doomsday scenario might play out. And that's where scenario thinking, scenario planning really was cultivated. And that is very much about, as you say, probabilistic thinking. It's about forecasting. It's quite scientific and very, very, very useful. On the other hand, there's an emerging line of thinking, which is more Eastern in its in the way that it's presented. And that doesn't necessarily say that the scientific futures thinking is wrong. What it says is that it's just one layer of how we need to be thinking about the future. The future really is a lot deeper than just that single layer. And the Eastern side of things really starts to inquire about what assumptions are baked into the way that you think. Right. And where do those assumptions come from? So in many ways, when we talk about used futures or we talk about disowned futures, I think of my own situation when I was just leaving school and I needed to choose what university degree and which university I was going to go study at. In many ways, I didn't have a choice. My choice was kind of handed to me by my parents because they said, listen, you're only 18 years old. You can't go and be a musician and go and, you know, study music. You're going to end up being a drug addict or something like that. So you need to go to a recognized university and go and do a nice business degree and, you know, follow a path where you're guaranteed of getting a job. Now, that was not a future which was mine, but in many ways, I followed that path and I kind of forgot about that story. I forgot about like how I started on this path. It was a future which wasn't my own, but I followed the path. I got the degree. I then went on to do a couple of other degrees. I worked in business. I worked in marketing, as you say. I tracked that path. Now, I think about the future in a very commercial sense. I work with business. I can speak the business language. But if I have to now try and unpack where my own thinking of the future is and where does it come from, I can track it back to a future that wasn't even mine. My future was actually music. So actually, if I want to really try and tap into what I actually want in the future, I have to really listen to myself very, very carefully. And finding my own voice in the noise of the last, 30 years is incredibly difficult. But the fact is that most strategy, most plans, most visions don't actually play out because they are not visions which really motivate the person. So if you really want to find a future which is preferable for an individual, you've got to dig super deep into that person to really understand what motivates them, or to really find what motivates an organization. Because organizations will say one thing, they want growth. We want to grow the business. But in actual fact, potentially that top layer of management, they just want to keep their jobs. they want to keep the $3 million bonus that they get at the end of the year. And the way they do that is don't rock the boat. So when they come and say like, oh, we want growth within these boundaries so that it doesn't rock the boat too much. So don't come with like radical innovations, which is potentially going to be risky. But that's not necessarily what they're saying to you. So that's why the Eastern tradition of futurist thinking, it really is about unpacking what's deep down within, an organization or within an individual that is unspoken, but is actually the driver of the way that they think. So you're trying to understand what the pervasive mindset is, because that mindset is very, very difficult to break free from, even with the most beautiful looking plans.
I'm quite keen to just bring in John for this because I feel that this is really interesting. Also, that you called it an Eastern mindset, because if anything, it's kind of moving away from the corporatized individual, if you like, and trying to map out that future, but rather going to an individual where their personal concerns or their personal circumstances are now part of the picture, are now part of the assessment of what kind of future is more likely to happen in front of them. And I think that there's something maybe even slightly deeper to explore, which is, I think, often the way that the sort of there's a kind of a consumerist type of line of thinking here where, you're incomplete as you are, and in order to fill that gap, you need to go out and buy stuff, right? Now, if we're kind of looking at an Eastern sort of bent to that, I would almost go as far as to say, the answer to that might be, well, you're not incomplete as you are. You actually are complete. You just maybe need to realize it or have a prompt to realize that. John, your thoughts on that?
You covered a lot. I think that I'm stuck with this the future shock work that we were discussing as I think about what you're saying and bringing that forward. The death of permanence has caused this disruption inside the human experience. We don't feel like we have anything we can anchor ourselves to, and we're not going to find it in the Western mindset currently, because of the Industrial Revolution and our most recent history. It's neither right nor wrong, it just is. So when in the West, when we don't have an Eastern philosophy, let me give you an example. Even here in the United States, before it was colonized, the American Indians had an amazing outlook on life that kept you grounded. It's kind of like when you sit and stare at a river, and over the course of your life, you can see that river change. There's change happening, but it's happening at a transformative way that we can understand and internalize. And we can hand that change down to the children in the tribe, in the clan, and explain our connection to it. Well, now our change happens so rapidly. But you just look at this one subject of quantum physics and try to put your mind around that in the last 80-year change there, you'll have a meltdown. And then you try to forecast that to the future, and you can't explain it to your children or to yourself. And this is the cause of all this angst that we're going through. I don't know if I'm answering your question, except to say that I find that, like, my why right now for me, and that I'm putting myself forward to help others, is connecting to that part of me that doesn't change. Because inside the human experience, when you close your eyes and you shut off all the change that's whizzing by at mind-breaking, the solution isn't shutting all the change down, it's going internal and connecting with your I amness, your posture of self-awareness. I am aware that I'm aware. And when I close my eyes, there's no one else inside this bag of skin but me in there with me. And I change at a different pace. And I'm getting older. I can, so if I connect more with the earth and can connect more with my awareness of being, I can better understand the rapid change going around me, and I don't get caught up in the drama. And that all has the Eastern position of understanding and philosophy speaks more readily to that than the most current Western traditions. I'll be quiet. I could go for another 20 minutes. I won't. You asked a kind of a broad question, and that's what popped up.
No, it was great. I'd love to get John's thoughts in a minute, but maybe just to attach to that is how then does the futurist's task change when now the kind of the variables or the kind of the the smallest common denominators, people in an everyday level, are now adopting those sorts of mindsets when they're not just economic units anymore. They're not buying cars and a chicken in every pot and all of that kind of stuff that we're maybe used to. But now there's this kind of free agency element going on. Does that impact how we sort of think about the future, Jon Cherry?
Well, Alex, I think the good thing is that futures thinking requires an open mind. And I think the real challenge for any futurist is that when people are so locked into their assumptions or their ideologies or just like their style of thinking, it's very difficult to kind of offer alternative pictures of what the future might look like under those conditions. So I think if people are open to alternative ways of being or alternative ways of thinking, that is like a major plus. And in many ways, I think, I don't know why, but the world seems to be like so binary. There's, we've come from this tradition where there's a right and wrong and you must pick your side and kind of stick with that. But in many ways, like what's required is all sorts of different types of thinking. You can't just say that linear or analytical thinking is wrong and, you need to do futures thinking or systems thinking. That is not the case. I don't want to fly an airplane that's designed by someone who's a systems thinker. I want an engineer to have designed that plane because I know that in the context of aviation, that's what works best. But I think what's really important is this combination and finding like the best combination for any context. And I think that's what the value of futures is that it's about understanding how, that's why it's called futures, because it is purposefully a multiple. There is no one future. There are many, many futures. And what you're kind of like nodding to is the complexity that exists in the world. And saying that you understand that there is complexity and it's impossible to try and understand what's really going on, but you're humble enough to, explore it. I think that's why you've called this the humble mind.
That's it.
You don't
you don't
have the answers, but you're bold enough to just experiment and to see where it might take you.
I absolutely, and I think that also for people who are starting businesses and going on all sorts of journeys, whether it's an internal journey or an external one, and you're helping people and you're wanting to be of service and give birth to a product or an experience that helps people or solves problems. I think that the ability to kind of extrapolate your thinking into a couple of different types of possible scenarios. Rather than kind of only, nailing your colors to the mast and planning for one, is a really strong, entrepreneurial plus. It's a kind of an instinct that I think should be nurtured in and amongst people. I think even at the school level, clearly we would benefit if we weren't just taught, this is geography, this is history, this is this, but also to kind of nurture another side where you're whether it might be in the way you debate or perhaps, entertain more colorful or creative versions of history or whatever it might be. But I think this element of different types of futures I think it's powerful because we're so used to thinking, just like you've said, that the future is this kind of one long arrow from the past into the future. And that's it. There's this unchanging concrete kind of thing, and you are powerless to kind of stop the train, right?
Exactly. And, for many people, I suppose, that don't have an open mind, that is their reality. There's a saying that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So in order to see those multiple futures and to see the future as a place of creativity, you yourself need to change. You need to train yourself to do that. And that really is what the work is all about. It's in that training. But in many ways, what I've found more and more is that I've put myself on an information diet. And I was saying to you last week, the family went away. And you know what? We purposefully didn't look at our phones. We purposely didn't watch TV. I purposely didn't even read any books, or I tried to do as little thinking as possible, because my job is thinking. And the only way I can think clearly, and the only way that I can not have this feeling of being overwhelmed when I go through that process, is to make sure that I have periods of no thinking. So I need to try and get to a point where, I meditate every day. I've really got to actively try and clear my brain, because everybody's trying to colonize your mind. It's a fight, and I'm starting to get pretty ruthless about it. And at one point, probably every 6 months, I go and unsubscribe from email newsletters, and I'm ruthless. I'd rather start from zero and then add than do it the other way around. But I think that's what we really need to be doing these days, is that information is not something which you need to hunt for. What you need to hunt for is silence. You need to hunt for that opportunity to think clearly, and that's where the power is. Get to the point where you've got a nice flat lake of thinking, and then you can drop a pebble into it, and it's going to have a nice big ripple. But getting there is tougher.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's almost as if as things kind of become more exponential, and more and more of our attention is not only at a premium, but it also seems to be sort of everything everywhere all at once at the same time. There's this weird thing going on with our attention, isn't it? Just like you said. And so now we're needing to treat it as if we're kind of almost hollowing out that whole part of our minds where there's you're returning to nothing, instead of going back to everything. But it's the only way to unclutter, only way to kind of
and that's real empowerment. As John was mentioning, this idea that, or Alex, it might have been you talking about consumerism, and about how we are programmed to kind of have desire that is given to us, and then our action is to purchase or join a community or feel something about something. But again, those are not necessarily wants that we want. That's research that goes back to Freud and his his nephew, I think, who started PR in the United States. PR, advertising, branding, marketing, these are things which use very powerful psychological triggers.
PR was started by Freud's nephew.
Right, Edward
No
Bernays.
way, I did not know that. That's insane, and it speaks volumes.
Yeah, Edward Bernays started PR, and his first campaign was called Torches of Liberty, where a tobacco company came to him and said, listen, we need more people to smoke cigarettes. So his campaign was that he got these debutantes during a parade in New York to lead the parade with lit cigarettes in their hands. And they called it the Torches of Liberty. So these were women who were going forth, and they were empowered because they were smoking cigarettes. And because of that, people were like, wow, these are empowered women. They're beautiful. We also want to smoke cigarettes. And it's a complete, Freudian hack. It's
the first influencers.
Absolutely. So I think, again, you've got to go back in history to understand what's going on now.
Always.
Understand, as you say, influencers. They were the first influencers. It's not new. It's a mind trick. So I think if you really want to start taking back control, the real answer to that is do less. Think less, read less. Just cut. Social media it's just the worst. They say it's bad for teenagers. I can tell you now, LinkedIn drives me crazy. If ever I want to depress myself, I just go onto LinkedIn. And it's not that people have bad intentions on LinkedIn, but the way that I absorb it and how it affects me, I have to be very, very careful with it.
Like you said, it's a diet, right? Yeah.
Right. And exactly, you don't eat junk food day in and day out, you'll kill yourself. And it's the same with information. It's become so pervasive that you've just got to be very, very careful with what you put into your brain.
Absolutely.
Because it really can affect your vision of the future. And that's something which is sacrosanct. That is yours to keep. And when you let other people into that space, they are literally colonizing your future. So, You know, it sounds
Yeah.
pretty radical, and even as I say it, I kind of cringe. But you know, that's how I feel about these things.
Colonize is a great word. John, you had something on your mind.
I do. That I love this conversation. That colonize your mind is an awesome way to conceptualize what's going on. What I want to point out or bring to the conversation is there's a nuance that I think bears recognizing, that there's a difference, at least today, between want and desire. I may want a new pair of shoes. I may want a fancy coffee. I may want to, do something like that. And so the torches of liberty and all that was speaking to the wants, and it's continued now on hyperspeed into the current, way things come across. What we've lost connection with, I think, broadly, is deep-seated desire that forms one's life's purpose with a mission and a why, that catapults you forward, that come hell or high water. This is what I am creating in my life. We early on, John said that you alluded to, we create the life that we want. And when I would say we create the life we desire, that which we hunger for, that goes beyond the surface want, but it's more of that deep-seated, deep inside. And to John's point, when you unplug in whatever methodology one needs to unplug, and here's what it comes down to. We've lost the art of noticing our deep desires. We're so busy hearing the noise of the wants and the colonization of what everybody wants my mind to do and me to be thinking about, that we've got to, and this is what I've given myself over to for probably the last 2 years, is learning to listen to the desires of my heart and learning to notice it. And I can't notice until, as John pointed out, the water gets calm. When the water's calm and I throw in that pebble because I found my desires, my deep-seated desire, and I throw that pebble in, and I can watch and foresee the future of my deep-seated desire rippling out across the calm water, I see my path forward. I know what to do next. And so when I get up, I'm ready to go. I'm resourced internally and I'm empowered. And this is the art that we used to have as a species broadly, that we've lost hold of because of the speed of change. Yeah. And so for us to teach people and to encourage people how to notice the desire, and I'll end with this. Neville Goddard, who died in 1972, has an amazing one sentence in his book. It godsmacked me. He said one sentence. He said that desire is a form of spiritual language. And it just leaped off the page. And I've been sitting with that for 2 years and putting that over the body of his other work and realizing that sentence is what led me to this diatribe I'm on now, and understanding the difference of want and desire. And so, John, kudos to you, because you're tapping into your desire, and we've got to unplug to do it.
It's I'd love to hear your response, but John, but also I think in many ways that a lot of the brands and the businesses that work around us to sort of take our attention and ultimately sell things to us, they're really in the business of hijacking desires, aren't they? And I don't necessarily mean that hijacking in a negative sense, but they're colonizing. They're kind of managing them for us, I suppose, right? So perhaps some of the other things in the toolkit that we can learn to use or to cultivate to face this sort of exponential future is to learn how to deal with those. And maybe it starts with what John said, which was noticing it at first, just knowing that kind of thing actually exists and that things are maybe a little bit differently wired than we might have thought.
Yeah, John, to your points, I agree with you. And I do like the way that you've sort of highlighted each one of those things as quite different. And I think your point is well made, because when you're working with teams and you're working with strategy and visions of the future, those plans often fall apart because they don't tap into people's desires. And a lot of the futures work is trying to understand how you not only affect someone's sort of the microcosm of their thinking, because if you tell somebody what to do, they're probably not going to go and do it because it's not of their own volition. But if they have the idea themselves and they stumble across it, and it's an idea which in many ways has formed in their own minds, you then start to tap into a deeper level of motivation or conation. I think that's the official term, where someone is compelled to act in order to achieve what it is that they want. So that really is what you're talking about there, about desire. Because in many ways, you've got to get to a point, if you're trying to create a different kind of future, you have to believe in that future enough that no matter what people say to you, you're just going to ignore them. You're going to carry on along your path because that path is going to be difficult. And that's really what you're talking about there, about desire and tapping into that desire and listening to yourself and trying to get to the point where you can hear your own voice. So you even know what those desires are. Because as Alex says, a lot of the time your wants and needs and desires are kind of handed to you by marketers. At my age,
I submit to you, John, that's how we reclaim our agency.
Right, exactly. So at my age, I'm programmed to desire to drive a C-class Mercedes-Benz, but I couldn't think of anything worse. Like I don't want to drive a C-class Mercedes-Benz. It's a lovely car, but I do not desire it as much as Mercedes wants me to. And I think that's what it is. When you reach a certain point in your life, society tells you that you should be at the pinnacle of your career. You should be making a lot of money. Your kids should be sort of out of school or nearing out of school, and you should be in your prime, getting ready for retirement. But now, even the concept of retirement, thinking that I might live until I'm 95. If I retire at 65, that gives me 30 years that I've got to sit and twiddle my thumbs. I'm not going to do that. That's crazy. So like this whole notion that 65 is when you put your feet up and you go and, travel is ridiculous. So we need a different thinking, even about retirement or about old age. The idea that when you're 90, you're crippled and frail and sit in an old age home and wait for death to come and pick you up, that's just so crazy. By then you might be a fully functioning person. You can facilitate workshops. You can do the work that you love. You can contribute. You can have a good level of well-being at that age, which wasn't accessible even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So we need a new future of aging, just as an example. I think that's why you've got to be very careful about what people say to you and the kind of like milestones that you ought to be hitting, or the things that you ought to have achieved. It's such nonsense.
Yeah. It really, it's interesting you said the space of, or the demographics of aging, because that is a really interesting, firstly, a kind of a human problem, but also I think plays right into our conversation about the future and kind of reimagining these things. So the country I live in, Spain, there is a massive demographic problem that's slowly kind of, you might know this, sort of unraveling itself. So by the year 2050, almost 1 in 3 people will be 65 years and older. Now, this is going to create all sorts of completely unprecedented social sort of problems. You're going to have way more people that aren't in the workforce that are going to have to be taken care of, a dwindling, kind of younger workforce who is working, but they're having less children, which also means that, there's not enough money to pay for. So it's all of these kind of, possible futures, if you like, as well, that are going to be playing out. It's almost as if there's lots of possible futures, but the direction of those futures are almost certainly going to happen. So it's an interesting sort of problem to kind of take on, where does this problem get reimagined from the individual, where, like you said, we're going to need to completely rethink how those last 30-40 years are going to be played out, because lifespans are only getting longer. Or does it come top down from the government trying to hand down some bureaucratic sort of law
Yeah, I think it's such an excellent point you make there, Alex. And I think it's a great example of why, we need these new futures, because that's really what we're talking about, is that things have changed so radically that that kind of like old aging narrative, the myth of aging, let's call it that, because there's an underlying cultural myth of what aging looks like. Now, if you put that myth of aging and you combine it with our current definition of capitalism, the two don't go together, because as you say, capitalism only works if you've got like these young people who are creating more and more productivity, which fuels the government, the state, in order to provide for the elderly who are old and frail. That's an old used future which is no longer applicable. So in many ways, the responsibility of that is with everybody. It's with government, it's with societies, it's with communities, it's with individuals. And that's really what the tricky bit is that I suppose we're all kind of waiting for each other and going, oh, who's going to do it? What do we do now? But in many ways, I guess what's required is the permission to have the creativity to just think about it in a different way. Because these kind of new futures are not based on like logic and thinking, which is academic or scientific. Those people will make a contribution as well. But what we need to do is really start to tap into what do we actually desire and what does that look like?
Yes.
It's not just about creating like a picture. It's like, what does that feel like? Who's going to be there? What does this place look like? How am I going to feel in this new place? We need to go to that level where it's not just a simple story. It's about a real vivid meditation on what it is that we want to create. And once we've got that, you can work backwards from there and go, right, in order to achieve that, what do we need? Well, we need to start having better discussions around capitalism and what's the future of that. How's it going to be more equitable? How's it going to be more sustainable? I mean, those are just 2 points on capitalism that need serious focus. But I suppose, people have to also demand it. People have to say, like, you know what, I'm not going to let my mind be colonized by marketers or by advertisers or by the state that wants to keep me in fear, so I keep on working or whatever it is. You have the choice. You have the agency. So I suppose step one is reminding people that the future is open to be created. It's not determined. Nothing in the future is determined. We seem to assume that everything is just going to be as it has always been, but it can be different. We can choose differently.
I love that.
And that's really what our job is to take responsibility to do that.
I think there's from my take and on what you're saying, it seems that there's a choice to be made, which I think is an extremely important and I think often a new concept for the majority of people to kind of to wrap their heads around, the fact that they have a choice in their lives and the kinds of things that are happening for them and not necessarily to them, and that they have an agency in choosing that moment by moment, but also that there's a level of creativity that's required to kind of suss things out, work with the variables in the moment, and then sort of create something, right? You create it. You don't just sort of like slog through it day to day. John, I'm keen to get your thoughts. And I know that when I use the create word, I know that there's a big smile that comes on your face. So what do you...
Yeah, for sure. We have lost, we keep using the word agency. I feel like due to our educational system and supporting of the Industrial Revolution and all that came with the birth of our cities, we lost touch with our creative ability. And so now we're told what to do, what to believe, when we retire, all the things that we're discussing, right? We've surrendered that. And with it has come the death, or I might be speaking too strongly here. I'll speak strongly, bluntly. I feel like has come the death of imagination or creativity. Where we don't value or understand the power of our human imagination when we do quiet and turn everything off and are with ourselves, that within the framework of who I am, I can do 4 things that I think we've lost touch of. And when we see revitalization of these four things, it will change the face of humanity long term. Specifically, to be able to use my imagination which, by the way, establishes our life path experience, right? To learn from a position of curiosity, which curiosity is out the window right now. You can't be curious if you're going to be programmed, right? Yeah. So to a resurgence of curiosity by fanning the flame of curiosity into humanity so that we can learn and then explore that which we've learned. So learn what you want to learn because you want to learn it, because you desire it. Then explore it. So learn, explore. When you explore, you're not learning anymore, you're playing with it. You're experimenting, you're noticing the changes. So learn, explore, then imagine, and then create. So when we learn, explore, imagine, create from a position of curiosity, we've reclaimed our agency. I don't need the government or societal approval. I can have this amazing expressive life, learning, exploring, imagining, and creating that which I choose to do. This is, in summary, is what we've lost.
Yeah.
When I was in Indianapolis, Indiana recently, I was there for a year buying a bunch of real estate, and I got an apartment in their downtown. And I have this clear memory of walking in their downtown. They've done an amazing job of preserving the structures and the buildings that were built around 1895, all throughout their downtown. And they're stunning. They're jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And you sit there and I stare at them and go, how did they do that? Knowing the limitation of tools, and we didn't have computers, and craftsmanship. And I stare at it and go, I don't think we could pull that off today because we've lost touch with that learn, explore, imagine, create side of humanity. But it's not forever gone. We will see it come back. It has to, because we're in crisis right now. And the only way to fix the crisis is to get reconnected to who we are in the manner that I'm describing.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's so well put. And funny enough, like you use the word reconnected, I think a lot of the new interesting futures work is about that idea of reconnecting with things that we have kind of lost touch with. I kind of want to say that, the original futurists were the shamans in the tribe. And those were the people that were really given the responsibility to help guide and lead the tribe in a spiritual context.
Yes.
Because
yes.
The way that they felt as a community, like their spiritual consciousness and their spiritual evolution was the way that they kept the tribe close and tight. And that's what their real strength was their, interconnectedness and understanding how together they were more powerful than apart.
Yes.
And, we think about this whole idea of trust, and we talk about communities and how people are trying to, reconnect with communities. And in many ways, a lot of the interesting futures work is connected with spirituality. And we're starting to try and see that actually a spiritual aspect or a spiritual consciousness is also something which we've largely forgotten about.
Yeah,
because
it's a variable. Yeah.
Organized religion has again kind of colonized that, and people are understandably a little bit like skeptical about organized religion. But that doesn't mean to say that, sure, but that doesn't mean to say that spirituality is no longer of use. And I suppose as individuals, we're starting to experiment with different, aspects of spirituality. But I think there's value in bringing those kind of mindsets into groups, and how we collaborate as a group of people. What are our values and the ethics that hold us together, and those kind of frameworks, and how do they play into what we're trying to create and build? That kind of research is still in its infancy, because I think a lot of it is discounted because you can't prove it empirically. But there's value there. There definitely is.
Absolutely. And especially when you start looking at the, I mean, not to go completely off a tangent, we'll need to definitely have another podcast, gentlemen, where we pursue this in more kind of detail, because there's this, there's the spiritual kind of element, but not only in a kind of a sort of being seen through the lens as another variable with which to still play the same scientific kind of game, but also as its own value as an experience as well. And like you said, shamans and so on. Let's not discount the experience and the felt value of plant medicines and so on, all sorts of other things that can push you in that direction. But we won't go down that road today. But just to maybe kind of round us off, and I'm keen to hear from each of you. What do you think are the kind of as a hot round, are the three kind of tools, if you like, that an individual, an entrepreneur, a business owner, somebody trying to make sense of all of these exponential forces that seemingly seem to all be accelerating at the same time with the same sort of intensity? What are 2 or 3 things that should be in their rucksack, that should be in their toolkit to sort of help navigate things, help to make sense of it, and also help to kind of, distinguish the opportunity from what otherwise might just look like somebody else's crisis? Jon Cherry, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing for me is that, I've been banging on about it in this session, but for me, it might not seem like a tool, but the quietening of the mind is a practice, which I think is of huge value in the context of what's going on. As I said before, it's easy to find information. That's not the difficult bit. What you really need to do is get into the practice of quietening the mind, but also when you see information, try and see it in the context of where it's coming from, or what is it a part of? How is this thing a part of something which is a bigger picture, and how is that like changing in a broader perspective, and what does that then mean for you? Just as an example, we often talk about sort of changes in consumer behavior, and yeah, you can read the granular detail about how people are changing, and sales mechanics are working and other sales mechanics aren't, and there's data and there's insights and all that kind of stuff. But if you pan back and you just look at what people are really wanting, consumers themselves are tired. They're also overwhelmed with choice. They are punch drunk with dopamine, because that's what consumerism is. It's just feeding you dopamine, and people are tired of it. You've got to do bigger and more extraordinary things in order to get the same kind of hit. Before you would just buy a 20 cents chappy or a piece of bubble gum at your local shop. Now you've got to buy a Lamborghini. I mean, it's ridiculous. So in many ways, you've got to just see these broad changes and understand how that is affecting your strategy and how you play into that into the future. How might that unfold into the future? So first one is go about having an information diet, first of all. Then when you do consume information, look at the big picture changes. And maybe a third one is, if you're going to consume information, make sure that it is of very high quality. So, as much as I think it's wonderful that everybody has a voice, I also think that not everybody should have a voice. I think there are a lot of people who should be on permanent mute because they talk crap. So, if I can really urge you, is be very cautious about what information you do consume. Make sure it's from a credible source. Make sure that you're not getting all excited about something which you receive via WhatsApp. I suppose that's what I'm trying to get at, is just make sure that before you allow it to colonize your thinking, that it is information of value, and it is something which I think you should pay attention to.
Excellent points. Wow. Punch drunk on dopamine, colonize your mind. We can start a bumper sticker business here, guys. I'm pretty impressed. John, to you, to wrap up, what are the 2 or 3 things in your toolkit that you'd recommend to make sense of what's going on?
And you framed it by saying to someone who is, an entrepreneur or someone related to the work, and the doing of life. So in that context, I would say the number one thing I would encourage people to keep in their toolbox is something that they already have, but we forget it. It often falls to the bottom of our bag. It needs to stay at the top. And it's the power of why. Why did you start what you started? Why in the beginning? Why? That why that's connected to that deeper desire. And here's why I bring that up. If you say to an entrepreneur or someone on a career path, why are you doing this? They'll say, because I want to make money. Well, and then that's usually the accepted answer. And if you're doing it because you want to grow coin, you've lost touch with your why. I've been a real estate agent for a number of years throughout the decades of my life, and I would go and help. I just buy volumes of homes for clients of mine, and I would sit down at a dining room table with someone, and I would say, "Tell me why you want to sell this house," and they would say, "Well, because I want all the money I can get." And their goal was sell the house to get money. But I learned the power of reconnecting them to their why by saying, "Yeah, but why? What are you going to do with the money when you sell your house?" And then once I asked that next level question, there was a story, because I want to fill in the blank. And it was usually go somewhere, build something, start something. And then that became their new why. So when we keep our desire or our why as the main tool at the top of our bag, it'll be easier for you as an entrepreneur and someone going through life to not get caught up in the marketing, everybody coming at to colonize your mind, right? No, I'm not doing that. No, I'm not looking at life that way. I'm doing this because this is my why. So keep your why. That's my number one recommendation. Know your why. And if you don't know your why, spend time to find your why. There's some great resources, some great literature on helping you find and discover your own why without somebody telling you what they think your why should be. Protect that. It's your why, not someone else's idea of what your why should be. Know your desire, know your why. Get help finding your why with somebody who can ask you really good open-ended questions that doesn't try to direct your why. Once you have it, keep it at the top of your visibility. My why sits right there. It's mounted on my wall right there. I can turn and see it right there. It's always in front of me, and it guides my every decision I make. So I'm at peace and I have continuity in my life at all times. I know my why.
Love that. Wow. Awesome. Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for such a extemporaneous but fabulous conversation that we ended up having. I think we covered so much ground, and definitely a lot of seeds there for many more conversations in the future. Thank you so
awesome.
much,
John, thank you. John, thank you. You gave me a lot to think. You gave me so much to think about. I've taken great notes. Alex, thank you for hosting.
We need it quiet in your mind.
Yeah. Wonderful.